Picture yourself in a narrow stone passage where the walls are cold and the only sound is the muffled flicker of a low-burning torch. The air is still, carrying the distant scent of damp earth and faded parchment. Let your breath slow with the quiet rhythm of the past, and allow this hush to settle around you. Tonight, our story will drift along the quiet corridors of medieval justice, where even the youngest were not spared its heavy hand. There are no great battles here, no kings, no crowns, just the slow shadowed tale of how children, small and unsure, were punished like grown men. Let this gentle unfolding become a quiet current, carrying your thoughts toward calm and rest. If this gentle journey brings you comfort, you're welcome to leave a quiet like or subscribe. I always love to see where in the world you listen, and the hour at which you drift off. Share your peaceful place in the comments below if you wish. The apple was overripe, bruised where it had rolled down the muddy path beside the market cart, its skin freckled with tiny brown spots. No one claimed it. No one wanted it. It sat for an hour in the straw until a boy passed by and picked it up. His name was Matthew. He was 9, his feet were bare, and the wool tunic he wore had once belonged to a cousin, or someone like a cousin, but the elbows had long since been patched with mismatched cloth. His hair was the colour of dry earth, his eyes steady. He was not a thief, not really, but he was hungry, and in that village, just north of Rouen near the River Bend, hunger had its own laws. The apple wasn't his, and so in the eyes of the market keeper, it was stolen. It wasn't the market keeper who caught him, it was a guard, bored, heavy-set, leaning on his staff with the posture of someone more used to pointing than lifting. He saw the boy take the apple, saw him glance around, saw him bite into the flesh as if it were the most natural thing in the world. The shout came too quickly, and just like that, the moment of sweetness was over. Matthew was dragged by the wrist to the market post, where a few passers-by gathered, not because they cared, but because public scenes were rare, and distraction was more precious than flour. The market keeper pressed his point. The boy had stolen. It didn't matter that the apple was bruised. It didn't matter that it had rolled away from the cart, or that no coin had exchanged hands. Property was property, and the boy, small as he was, had broken the boundary that separated honest hunger from criminal intent. The bailiff was summoned. His cloak was damp from the drizzle, and his mood was short. He asked no questions of the boy, only heard the word theft and nodded. The village had recently issued a new rule for petty crimes, one meant to discourage youthful mischief. Those were the exact words, written in ink by someone who had likely never gone hungry. The rule stated that any person, regardless of age, caught in the act of theft would be secured overnight in the holding yard, as example and instruction. It was meant to sound fair, even progressive, but the reality was simpler. Shame made better warnings than sermons, and so Matthew, 9 years old, was chained. Not tightly, not cruelly, just enough. He was led to the holding yard, a narrow strip of stone beside the town hall, half sheltered by an overhang, overlooked by everyone and visited by no one. The shackle was too big for his ankle. They wrapped it in cloth to keep it from slipping. There were already 2 others in the yard. Grown men, one arrested for drunkenness, the other for shouting curses at the baker's assistant. Neither looked at the boy. One turned his back, the other sighed and sat down on a bucket. Matthew stood for a long time. He didn't cry, he didn't ask to go home, because he didn't have one, not in the way people imagined. His father had died 2 winters ago from a fever that took half the alley. His mother washed rags when she could, begged when she couldn't. They lived in a lean-to behind the cooper's shed. He had come to the market hoping for crumbs. He had found an apple, and now he was here. The hours passed. No one brought food, no one spoke. A boy is not meant to be treated like a man. But in this place there was no room to be anything else. A woman passed in the early evening and frowned when she saw him. Too young, she muttered, but she didn't stop. The candlelight in the town hall windows flickered as dusk arrived. The rain came again, not hard, just enough to soak the hem of his tunic. He sat finally, legs curled beneath him, head resting against the cold wall. No blanket, no words, just stone. And still no one asked the question that sat like a stone in the stomach. Was the apple really the crime, or was the crime simply being seen? The night did not pass quickly. Stone does not soften, and even the drizzle seemed to hang in the air rather than fall. Matthew remained curled against the wall, the chain slack around his ankle, the cloth padding slowly turning to pulp in the damp. He didn't shiver, not because he wasn't cold, but because his body had learned long ago that warmth was a luxury, not a right. He breathed shallowly, eyes half closed, ears open for any sign of his mother. She never came, not because she didn't care, but because no one had told her where he'd gone. The two men sharing the yard with him slept in turns. One snored loudly, the other muttered curses in his sleep. Neither looked at Matthew when the bells rang at midnight. In truth, they didn't know what to say. What does a grown man say to a child in chains? At sunrise, the clerk arrived to record the names of the detained. He stopped when he saw Matthew still there, small and stiff, his face shadowed from the overhang. "This one still here?" he asked, voice uncertain. The constable nodded. "Caught with fruit. Took it right off the ground." "Still," the clerk said, writing with slower strokes. "He's barely more than a child." The constable didn't answer. The rules, after all, had been written plainly. Any person. By mid-morning someone had fetched the priest. Not because of Matthew, because one of the older men had shouted blasphemy again, and the clerk thought prayer might quiet him. But when the priest arrived and saw the boy, he stopped. "Whose is this?" he asked quietly. "He belongs to no one," the constable replied. The priest stepped forward, knelt to Matthew's level. His robes brushed the mud. He asked the boy his name. Matthew answered, softly. When asked about the apple, he said it was already on the ground. That somehow hurt more than a confession. The priest stood slowly. This is not what chains were meant for. But rules did not bend for sentiment. Not yet. So the priest left, promising to speak with the alderman. By then the town had begun to stir. Market carts rolled back through the square, and the stallkeepers prepared their produce with eyes half turned toward the holding yard. Some saw the boy, most looked away. But one child, perhaps a year older than Matthew, passed with his mother and asked aloud, "Why is he there?" The mother tugged his arm. "Because he stole," she whispered. "But we picked apples last week." We were allowed. The difference was never explained. By noon the bailiff returned. This time he looked tired. The priest had spoken. The clerk had hesitated. Even the constable, who had first dragged the boy to the post, now stood with his arms crossed more tightly than usual, gaze cast low. The bailiff waved once. The shackle was removed. The chain coiled like a sleeping snake. Matthew stood rubbing his ankle. No one apologised. But they handed him a heel of bread. He took it with both hands, unsure whether it was kindness or proof, then walked, limping slightly, out of the yard and into the light. No one stopped him. No one asked where he would go. The apple had been forgotten, but the chain's weight lingered, even in absence. And so the boy walked home, not knowing whether the lesson had been about theft, shame, or something far quieter, what it means to be born where mercy isn't free. Matthew did not return to the market after that, not for many weeks. He kept to the alleys, to the edges of courtyards where the laundresses beat linen against stone and didn't ask questions. When he walked quickly, with his head down, one hand always brushing against his thigh, as if still feeling the phantom weight of the shackle. His mother never asked where he'd been. Perhaps she knew, perhaps she didn't want to know. Either way, when he appeared again in the doorway of the lean-to, thin and smudged with sleep, she only reached for him, pulled him into her chest and said nothing. That silence became his shelter. The boys in the alley didn't tease him. They'd heard what happened. Some had brothers who'd been chained. One had been whipped for pulling onions from the convent garden wall. They didn't talk about it, but they understood. And in their world, understanding was rarer than food. The bruises faded, but the bruising inside did not, because Matthew had learned what few adults ever said plainly, that there were no second chances when you were poor and small, that a child could be treated like a man if the wrong person was watching. And that punishment wasn't just a tool, it was a language, spoken by those who had power, and rarely understood by those it was spoken to. He never stole again, not because he feared the chain, but because he feared the eyes, the watching, the silence that followed. He found work eventually, carrying sacks for a tanner who paid in crusts and copper slivers. He never complained, never asked for more. And when the tanner's wife offered him an apple from the bottom of the barrel, he took it with both hands and asked, "Are you sure?" She looked puzzled, then nodded. He didn't eat it until she walked away. Years later, when Matthew was nearly grown and worked in a tannery across the river, a boy was brought into the market yard, caught with bread this time, too young to have known better. He looked no older than Matthew had once been. Matthew stopped, stared, then stepped forward, and placed 2 coins, small warm from his palm, into the constable's hand. "He's with me," he said. Don't. It wasn't true, but it didn't matter. The chain was never fixed to the boy's ankle, and Matthew never explained himself, because in the end he had learned this, that mercy could be given quietly, that the memory of stone didn't fade just because your feet were free, and that while some people forget a child's name the moment they're punished, others carry it like a bruise under their ribs, soft and silent forever. Her name was Colette, and she had only just turned 10 when she laughed inside the chapel. It was not a loud laugh, nor cruel, nor disruptive by intent. It escaped her, soft, high, and brief. While the priest was droning through a list of saints' names no one in the pews could follow, a name had caught in his throat. He stuttered, repeated it, and then mispronounced it so badly that a few heads turned, and Colette, sitting at the end of the third bench beside her older sister, let out a stifled giggle. She covered her mouth instantly, but it was too late. The priest heard. He stopped mid-chant. His eyes found her. Silence flooded the chapel, thicker than incense. Her sister gripped her wrist, but it was no use. The priest didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. He only stepped down from the altar after the service and announced in the stillness of the nave that disrespect in the house of God must be corrected. There was no trial, no discussion, only the sentence, given aloud as parishioners lowered their eyes. Colette would spend one night locked in the churchyard, alone. It was framed as penance, a lesson. To reflect, the priest said, on the solemnity of sacred space. But everyone knew it was punishment. Quiet, symbolic, enough to frighten her, enough to remind others. The churchyard was not vast, but to a child it was endless. Encircled by a low stone wall and the graves of those long buried, it smelled of wet moss and earth. The gate was iron, rusted at the joints, with a bolt that closed only from the outside. At dusk they led her there. She said nothing. No one explained the offence. No one asked if she was afraid. A lantern was left at the far end, half wicked and fading, and then the gate closed. The bolt slid, and she was alone. The wind moved through the chapel bell slowly, like breath. She did not cry, not yet. She sat on the cold ground, skirt pulled over her knees, and stared at the crooked names on the gravestones. Some were too worn to read. Others had moss growing inside their letters. She whispered a few aloud, unsure if they were meant to comfort or to warn. Night deepened, the lantern dimmed, and slowly, as her fingers began to ache from cold and the silence grew thicker than she'd ever known, the laughter that had once slipped so easily from her chest now felt like a stranger. She had not laughed at God. She had not mocked. But intent mattered little in a world that prized obedience over innocence. She thought of her sister, of the warm blanket on her cot, of the bread her mother always saved after supper. None of those things were here. Here she had dirt beneath her nails, a growing knot in her stomach, and a silence that pressed like stone. By midnight she began to shiver. By morning the gate would open, but something inside her would remain there, seated beside the dead, in the part of childhood that gets left behind not by growing up, but by being told it's no longer welcome. Which leaves us here, with a gentle wondering, when a child is punished for joy, how long does it take before joy becomes something they hide? When the church bell rang for lauds, and the sun began its slow rise over the low walls of the graveyard, the iron bolt slid open with a heavy click. It did not clang. It did not echo. It sounded only like the turning of something final, a sound that marked not freedom, but the end of a lesson no child had asked to learn. Colette stood as the gate creaked inward. No one greeted her, no hand took hers, only the sacristan, who motioned her forward without looking her in the face. She walked home with her head down, not from shame but from confusion, because what she had lost in that long night was not pride, it was something smaller, quieter, the ease of being herself. Her mother waited on the stoop. She did not embrace her. She simply opened the door and said, "You'll rest now, then sweep the floor." The floor was swept, the bedding straightened, the chores resumed, and no one ever spoke of the night again. But Colette did not laugh for many months. Her sister noticed first, the way she stopped telling little stories at supper, the way she sat stiffly during Mass, lips pursed, eyes wide, the way even the sight of something absurd, a chicken wandering into the bakery, a cat tangled in laundry, no longer sparked the sound that had once come so easily, because now every breath of joy had to pass through memory, memory of moss, of darkness, of gallants deeper than soil. At school she answered questions with nods instead of words. In play she waited for permission before joining, and in church she kept her eyes fixed on the floor. The priest said nothing more of her offence, but each time he passed her in the aisle she flinched just slightly, barely enough to notice, but enough to feel. The parish was small, life resumed, but something in Colette had changed. She was no longer the girl who giggles, she became the girl who listens, which sounded like a virtue. But inside it was a loss. Even other children noticed. A boy her age, who once traded pebbles with her behind the mill house, asked softly one afternoon, "Why don't you smile like before?" She didn't answer, because she didn't know, not in words, but in feeling. And yet one spring morning, months after that night, she sat in the grass behind the chapel watching the swallows weave between trees. They moved fast, foolish, happy, and one swooped so low and wobbled so wildly that it collided with its own shadow and startled itself into a tumble. The breath caught in her throat, her lips twitched, and for a moment, just the smallest one, she laughed. It was faint, brief, but real. No one heard, and that was what made it safe, which leads us to ask, not for Colette, but for every child who's learned too early to hush themselves. When a laugh is punished once, how long does it take before they believe silence is safer than joy? The years that followed blurred like threads drawn slowly through cloth. Colette grew taller, steadier, more careful. Her hands became calloused from work, her hair darker with age, but the memory of that night never truly left her, became something she carried, folded quietly between the layers of her daily life. Others forgot or at least stopped remembering aloud. The priest aged, the sacristan was replaced. The girl who once giggled in mass became the young woman who never interrupted, who never raised her voice, who listened more than she spoke. But within her, the laughter lived on, not loudly, not in the way it once had, spilling over during sermons and play. It became something smaller, like a spark tucked beneath kindling, ready but not reckless. She learned to control it, to keep joy folded inside her, safe from consequence. One winter the old priest passed away. A younger man replaced him, gentler in tone, slower in judgment. He did not know the story of Colette and the graveyard, but he noticed the stillness in her. During lessons with the parish children, he once asked her to lead a reading. She did carefully, her voice quiet but strong. When she looked up, he smiled and said, "You read like someone who listens with both ears." She blinked, and unexpectedly smiled back. Years later, when children whispered and giggled in the pews, it was Colette who turned her head, but not to hush them. She simply watched, and waited. And when the priest gave them a soft glance and chose not to scold, she exhaled. Because she remembered what it felt like to be silenced, not for their mischief, but for being too alive. She never told the full story, not even to her sister. But when she became a teacher of young girls in the parish, she kept the garden gate unlocked during lessons, and always ended each day with a question meant to invite laughter, a riddle, a rhyme, a trick of words, something that gave the children permission to smile, and when one of them laughed too loud and the others turned wide-eyed waiting for the frown, she smiled instead and said, "A laugh that surprises you is sometimes the best kind." Because she knew, more than anyone, that punishment has a long echo, but so does kindness. And though she had once been locked behind iron for a sound that brought her joy, she would spend the rest of her days ensuring no child would be chained for a voice that had not finished growing. They said it started with a candle, and it probably did. But whether the flame caught the dry hay by accident or by design was something no one could prove. Still, in the winter of that year, in a village pinned between two hills and a flooded road, there was a fire in the cooper's barn. The blaze was put out quickly, only one wall scorched, no livestock harmed, but the smoke had stirred more than embers. It stirred suspicion, and it found its target in a boy named Arnoul. Arnoul was 10, small for his age, with shaggy hair and hands that fidgeted even when empty. His father had died in a quarry collapse. His mother took in laundry when she could, and when she couldn't, she went without. Arnold spent his days trailing behind carts, kicking at stones, watching the older boys from behind fences. He wasn't well liked. He talked too much, asked too many questions, and though he was harmless children often became convenient when answers were needed quickly. It was the cooper's son who named him. He said Arnoul had been seen behind the barn just before the fire started, fiddling with something. "He looked nervous," the boy said. "He ran when he saw me. That was all it took. Arnold was taken not to his mother, but to the steward." He was questioned with candles burning, ink pot open, and the bailiff nearby. He was asked what he'd been doing near the barn. He said he'd only been looking for dropped nails. "Sometimes they fall," he whispered, "and I save them." The steward asked again, slower, "Did you take fire to the hay?" Arnold shook his head. "No, I only watched it burn." The room shifted at that. "Then you saw it start?" "No," Arnold said, suddenly unsure, "but it was bright." It was enough. The bailiff called it confession. The steward, not eager to be seen as lenient, signed the paper. The charge, reckless endangerment by fire. He would not be beaten, not publicly, but he would be tried formally. And that in itself was the punishment. Because in this village, trials weren't about truth. They were about memory. And no one would forget that the boy who asked too many questions now sat beside a candle, accused of nearly burning a barn. His mother wept, but was not allowed in the room. Arnoul was placed in the church that night, locked behind the wooden grate usually reserved for drunks and debtors. The candle burned beside him, not as light, but as evidence. He stared at it for hours, and the question that burned more slowly than any flame was not whether he had started the fire, but why no one believed that a child might simply be curious and not cruel. The morning of the trial came with frost clinging to the chapel windows. A hush hung over the village, not out of reverence, but from something colder, discomfort. Trials were rare, and when they came they were meant to be grim. But a child on the stand brought no honour to anyone involved. And yet the villagers came, not in crowds but in clusters, women with hands folded tight beneath their cloaks, men with mouths set hard, as if daring anyone to say it was wrong. Arnold sat at the front, not quite tall enough for the bench made for adults. His legs dangled, bootless. He'd lost them somewhere between the steward's hall and the chapel door. His tunic was too thin. His voice, when asked to state his name, was barely a whisper. The priest opened the proceeding, not with a sermon, but with a reading from Leviticus, one about fire and purity and punishment. The steward read the charge again. The cooper's son was called to speak. He said again what he'd said before, that he saw Arnoul near the barn, that he'd run when seen, that he'd heard a sound like laughter just before the smoke began. Arnoul didn't deny it. "I was there," he said softly, "but it was already lit. I watched it. It looked like the sun when it rises." That made some in the room shift in their seats, because it wasn't denial, but it wasn't guilt either. The candle on the table flickered. The steward leaned forward. "Did you want the barn to burn?" "No." "Did you light it?" "No." "But you didn't tell anyone it had started?" Arnold hesitated. "No." "And why not?" He looked at his hands. "I didn't know if it would be bad." There it was, a child's truth, full of gaps, and yet painfully clear. He had seen the fire. He had not feared it, and for that, they saw danger. After a short recess, the decision was announced. Not guilt exactly, but not innocence either. He would not be whipped, but he would be bound to public duty. For 6 months, he was to report to the watchman each morning and spend the day hauling waste from the ditch near the tannery. He was to sleep in his home, but only under watch. He was to attend Mass twice weekly and remain silent during all instruction. A candle would be kept near him at all times, to remind him. It was called mercy, but mercy in this village was a colder thing than justice. Arnold said nothing. His mother took his hand as they led him out. She didn't speak either. And the villagers? They dispersed quickly. No one congratulated anyone. No one even looked at the boy. Because it is easier to try a child than to accept that the world made him their way. Which leads us quietly to this reflection. If a child watches fire, and is punished not for what he does, but for what they fear he might do, who is truly responsible for the smoke? They gave him a bucket and a bent-handled rake. That was the full extent of his tools. Each morning, just after dawn, Arnold climbed from the lean-to beside his mother's quarters and trudged to the edge of the village, where the waste trench curved beside the tannery wall. There, amid the stink of skins and the steady trickle of runoff, he began the work of penance. Not for theft, not for violence, but for the mistake of standing too close to a fire and not running fast enough to be forgotten. The ditch duty was meant to be corrective. A lesson in humility, the steward had called it, but for Arnoul it was something else entirely. It was cold, it was muddy, it was humiliating, but it was also quiet, and in that silence he began to listen to the world in a new way. He noticed how frost held on longer in the shade of the chapel, how the crows always arrived in pairs, how the candle by his side, still required by the bailiff's order, flickered differently depending on which way he faced. The villagers barely spoke to him, some looked past him, others looked through him, but the waste was always waiting. That part of the sentence never failed. One afternoon, weeks into his sentence, a stranger passed by, a cobbler from another town, riding with his goods strapped to the back of a tired mule. He paused when he saw the boy, mud-streaked, head down, a thin flame dancing beside him. "What's that for?" the cobbler asked. Arnold answered honestly. "To remind me." "Of what?" The boy didn't know how to say it simply, so he said, "Fire and people." The man looked at him for a long moment, then nodded. "You'll grow out of it," he said, "or into it," and walked on. That evening Arnold watched the candle burn low beside him, its wax pooling into the same spot where he had set it each night. It no longer frightened him, but it didn't comfort him either. It was just there. 6 months passed, no fires, no laughter, just smoke in other people's chimneys, and a reputation he couldn't scrub clean. When his sentence ended, no announcement was made. The bucket was taken, the candle too, and Arnoul, now a little taller, a little quieter, was told he could return to school, but he didn't. He chose to work. With hands, not books, he became a thatcher's assistant, then a cartman's runner. He learned how to patch roofs and clean gutters and mend broken shutters, tasks that kept him busy and far from questions, but whenever a barn burned in a neighbouring village, or a stray ember caught in dry brush, people looked at him, just briefly, and he knew what they were thinking. He never lit a fire again, but the one they lit around him, that one smouldered in memory. Years later, when he became old enough to train a younger apprentice, he told the boy, "Never stare too long at flames." "Why?" the boy asked. Arnold answered, "Because some people only see the danger in your gaze." And the boy didn't understand, not then, but one day he would. Because in some corners of the world, a child doesn't need to be dangerous to be punished, and just close enough to blame. Her name was Izan, and she was 11 when it dropped. The jug, earthenware, old but still serviceable, had been balanced on her hip as she crossed the courtyard behind the inn. It wasn't full, only half, the ale sloshing gently against the clay as she moved toward the stable door where the groom waited. He had asked for a second portion. She hadn't questioned it. The boy was always kind to the horses, and she was used to being sent. Her hands were cold that morning. The frost hadn't yet lifted, and the flagstones were slick with the melt from the barrel trough. One small slip of her heel, and the jug struck stone. It didn't shatter, but cracked wide at the neck, and what was left of the ale bled out across the ground, seeping between the stones like it was trying to hide. She stood for a moment, staring down, the sound of the spill louder in her ears than any shout could have been. Then she looked up, and the innkeeper's wife was already standing at the threshold. Izan was not her daughter. She was a ward of sorts, taken in after her mother died in childbirth the year before. Her father had been a tanner's apprentice who left and never returned. The inn had fed her, clothed her, and in exchange she worked, from before dawn to after supper, scrubbing floors, carrying slops, hauling linens. No one ever called her servant, but no one called her child either. The innkeeper's wife crossed the yard quickly, saw the jug, the empty puddle, the girl. "You're to pay for that," she said coldly. Izan didn't speak. She knew better than to plead. "It was meant for a paying guest. That's theft." The word hit harder than the frost. Theft. Theft meant dishonesty. Theft meant punishment. Before she could speak, wait, before she could even blink, she was grabbed by the wrist and pulled inside. The groom, still standing by the stable, said nothing. He looked down. The horses snorted. The yard emptied. Inside, the kitchen fire crackled. The other workers turned away. A strap of boiled leather, kept above the hearth for pigs and punishment alike, was taken down. Izana didn't run. She only asked, "Can I clean it up first?" "No!" the woman snapped, and the blows came quickly. Not many, but loud, visible, and most of all, public. Afterward, Izana was sent back to work. No bandage, no words, just the broom. The cracked jug was thrown into the waste pit. The ale dried into the stones. The groom drank water instead. No one mentioned it again. But Izanne remembered, not because of the pain, because of the word theft. She hadn't taken anything, but she had been named, and in the village ledger of justice, sometimes being blamed meant more than being guilty, which leaves us at the start of something quieter than anger. When a child breaks something out of clumsiness and is punished as a thief, what does she grow up learning about fairness? The welt faded within a few days, but the word did not. Theft became a shadow that followed Izanne even when the stones had dried and the jug had long since been replaced. She swept more carefully now, carried every plate with 2 hands. When asked to deliver anything to the guests, she moved slower than she needed to. Measured, cautious, deliberate. The other children in the kitchen, 2 boys brought in from the tenant farm nearby, began to mimic the way the innkeeper's wife looked at her. Not angry, just just disappointed. Quiet suspicion in every glance. No one said the word again, but no one needed to. Once a label is placed on a child, especially one without a mother to defend her, it clings like wood smoke. The inn's guests changed often. Merchants, travellers, pilgrims. None of them knew what had happened, but the regulars, those from the village, watched her differently. One woman insisted her bread be brought by someone else. Another placed her coin on the table instead of in Izanne's hand. She never protested, but she noticed. Every act of distance, every withheld kindness. The innkeeper himself was absent most days, tending to the grain stores or managing deliveries. He never asked how the jug had been broken, never inquired about the punishment. He trusted his wife to manage the house, and she did, with precision and unquestioned authority. The groom, who had asked for the ale in the first place, tried once to speak to Izanne. It was during morning stable duty, when she brought the grain pail and he stood brushing down one of the geldings. "I didn't know he began. She didn't let him finish. "It doesn't matter," she said. But it did, because it wasn't just about ale. It was about being seen, not as a child who made a mistake, but as a servant who should have known better. A girl who should have been invisible until she wasn't. That winter, work slowed. Fewer guests meant fewer chances for her to be noticed, but not being noticed didn't mean being safe. One afternoon she dropped a spoon. It clattered to the floor and rolled beneath the table. Everyone turned. She froze. No one moved. Then one of the boys laughed. Just a breath, quick, sharp, the room relaxed. But Izanne remained frozen in place because in that moment she wasn't in the kitchen. She was back in the yard, the jug at her feet, the word theft in the air. And though no punishment followed this time, something became clear to her. The fear hadn't left. It had simply settled into her muscles, her posture, the way she stepped lightly, even when alone. Because once a child is punished not for what she meant to do, but for how others choose to see her, she learns that the safest thing to be is small. Spring returned to the village with its usual promises. Softer wind, thinner mud, and more mouths to feed. The inn grew louder again. Boots tracked in from trade roads, shutters banged in the night, and the hearth burned long past midnight. Guests filled the benches, trays grew heavier, and Izanne, now 12, moved through it all like a shadow trained to avoid notice. She still carried jugs, though not the large ones anymore. Those were given to the older boys. She served bread, fetched water, swept endlessly, and in all that time not a single coin passed through her hands. It was an unspoken rule. Izanne did not touch the money. She never asked why. But she saw how it happened, saw how the other children were trusted to carry change, to collect from guests, to count under supervision. She was trusted to carry plates, and that was all. One night, a merchant from Lisseau asked for a second helping of stew. When Izanne brought it, he smiled kindly and handed her a silver halfpenny. "For your trouble," he said. She froze. It was the first time anyone had offered her a coin directly in months. She didn't take it. She stepped back, hands still at her sides. The merchant looked confused, then placed the coin on the table and nodded, and she left it there. Later, the innkeeper's wife found the coin still sitting in the bowl. She said nothing, but the next morning Izanne was scrubbing the stoop again, twice over, not as punishment, just as reminder. And Izanne understood in her bones that it didn't matter whether she ever took anything, because she had already been decided. Her loyalty didn't matter. Her honesty didn't matter. What mattered was the story others had written about her. A girl who once spilled ale, a girl who was called Thief. That was the story they remembered, so she made her own. Each evening, before sleep, she began to scratch marks into the wooden post by her cot. One for each day she finished her chores without mistake, not to prove anything, just to keep track. Her own way of recording that she had done no wrong. The marks grew, seasons passed. She grew too, stronger, quieter, but not broken. And when she turned 14, a woman passing through the village asked if she might take Izan with her as a domestic in another town, for light work, better food and a fresh start. The innkeeper's wife was reluctant, but the innkeeper agreed. Without ceremony, Izan packed her things, a threadbare blanket, a comb, and nothing else. Before leaving, she walked to the waste pit, where shards of the broken jug still lay half buried in mud and ash. She found one, washed it, and kept it in her apron pocket, not as a reminder of shame, but as proof. She had survived what others had written about her, and from that day on, no matter where she went, whenever someone looked at her with suspicion before knowing her, she would touch the shard in her pocket and think, "I never stole, but you believed I would. That's on you, not me." They came just after the harvest, when the fields were bare, and the frost had begun to creep across the thatch. 3 boys, none older than 12, arrived with no shoes and no plan. Their names were rarely remembered. Perhaps Benoit, perhaps Tomelin, perhaps Gervais, but the village would remember them as those barn boys, a title that told more about where they had been found than who they were. No one knew exactly where they came from. Some said they were from the north, from a hamlet swallowed by fire or plague or lords' quarrels, details blurred like fog on cold panes. Others claimed they had never had homes at all, just drifted from market to market, snatching crusts, hiding under carts, whispering names that changed by the week. What was known, though, was this. They had slept in the Reeves' barn. It wasn't a crime, not officially. But in a village where wood was scarce and grain even scarcer, the fear of theft hung heavier than any law. The boys were found at dawn, curled into the straw near the oxen stall, cloaked in one another's warmth and straw dust. The door latch had been loose, left so by the Reeves' own son, likely. But that didn't matter. They were there, and the hay had been disturbed. The Reeve called for the bailiff. The bailiff didn't ask questions. Within the hour, the boys stood shirtless in the courtyard. It was to be instruction, they said. A lesson. For whom, no one asked. A rope was looped from one beam to the next. Not gallows, just display. The lash was not iron-tipped, only braided leather, cracked from long use. The oldest boy, who may have been Benoit, took the first blow without sound. The second boy cried out. The third wet himself before the lash even touched him. They were given 3 strikes each, not 5, not 10. 3 for trespass. But the trespass, everyone knew, was not in sleeping in the barn. It was in being poor, in not belonging, in needing something that others believed should not be free. They were told to leave immediately after. No bread, no bandage. No one followed to bird them, but no one helped them either. They walked down the rutted path, their backs striped, their heads low. One of them turned, just once before the trees swallowed them. He didn't shout, didn't cry, just looked, long enough for every man in the square to feel the weight of being watched by a boy who had learned that pain can be given for simply being tired in the wrong place. Which brings us to a harder question than most. When the cost of shelter is blood, what are we really protecting? The boys did not return. That, the villagers told themselves, was proof the punishment had worked. A whipping is short, they said. Better a few lashes now than worse crimes later. That was the logic, the dull, daily reasoning of people who had roofs and hearths and food set aside in sacks. But in the minds of the boys who walked away bleeding through their sleeves, the memory did not fade with the bruises. They kept moving, as children without guardians always did. They found shelter where they could, under broken carts, near fallen walls, once even in the hollow of a tree, wrapped in each other's arms as they watched for dogs and men. They no longer trusted barns. They no longer trusted quiet places. Because now they knew, stillness could become accusation. In another village farther south, they stole 2 apples and weren't caught. In a town by the river, they were turned away at the gate before even asking for bread. One night they found a baker's lean-to left open. They didn't take anything, just rested. But at first light they ran before anyone could find them. Even safety felt like a trap now. They learned to move quietly, to eat quickly, to speak less, to never close their eyes all at once. The oldest boy, Benoit, if that was his name, began to limp. One of the lash cuts had never closed cleanly. It wept now, especially when he walked too long. The others tried to help him, but there was no ointment, no rest, just miles, and cold and dirt. In a town that didn't ask too many questions, a mason took them on for a week, letting them carry tools and sleep near the stones. He said nothing of the welts when he saw them changing into dry shirts, just handed them boiled cabbage and a torn blanket. One of the boys asked if they could stay longer. The mason didn't answer. The next morning the gate was locked. Eventually they stopped trying to stay anywhere. They became like the dust on the road, moved only when no one was looking. Benoit, limping now constantly, tied a rag around his thigh. One boy found a dead dog and skinned its hide for warmth. The third never spoke after sundown, not because of fear, but because he had learned that silence was easier than begging. None of them ever broke into a barn again, not because they didn't need to, but because pain had taught them something no rule ever could, that a place meant for animals was not meant for them, not in the eyes of those who claimed it. Which leaves us with a truth too many forget. When survival is treated as a crime, where then can children go? No one remembered when the three boys stopped travelling together. Perhaps it was a fork in the road, perhaps an illness, or simply the slow erosion that comes when children are forced to act like men before their bones are fully grown. There was no farewell, no plan. Just one morning, a path taken by one and not the others. That's how these stories fade. Not with drama, but with distance. The oldest, Benoit, if that was his name, was last seen outside the walls of a port town helping unload sacks of barley. His limp was worse then, but he still carried with both hands. The dockmaster said he worked hard, never spoke unless asked. One day he didn't show up. The sackmaster assumed he'd moved on, but in truth no one really noticed. Just another quiet boy who didn't ask for much. The second found a place among a troop of travelling mummers. He couldn't read, but he could mimic animal sounds well, and sometimes that was enough to keep a belly half full and a bed half dry. He slept beneath the carts, behind the props. He smiled when performing, but afterward, he was always the first to retreat when voices grew loud. The third, smallest, silent, was rumoured to have ended up at an abbey. A cook's boy, peeling turnips in silence, learning to blend in with the stone. One monk noticed the way he flinched whenever someone reached too quickly for a ladle. But the monk said nothing, just passed him extra broth when no one was looking. The village where they were whipped forgot them almost entirely. The reeve who ordered the lash died of fever 2 years later. The barn was rebuilt. The leather strap was eventually replaced with a new one. But the shame? That stayed. Not for the village, for the boys. Because their lives had been marked not by the absence of love, but by the presence of suspicion. A suspicion so routine, so casual that it passed as ordinary justice. And as those boys became young men, scattered across counties, faceless among the poor, they carried not vengeance, but caution. They did not teach children to trust barns. They did not stop to ask for warmth. They learned to walk through the world as though it owed them nothing, and they were rarely wrong. No records were kept, no apologies were ever offered, but somewhere, on some cold night, when another child approached a low barn door and reached for the latch, maybe one of those boys, now grown, now watching, gently pulled the hand back and said, "Not here, not like the pa." Because sometimes the best kindness we can offer is to keep others from the punishments we once endured alone. The dice were carved from bone, nothing special, just 2 small cubes yellowed from age, with pips burned into each side. He'd found them near the ditch that edged the blacksmith's yard, half buried in frost and straw. They might have fallen from someone's satchel. They might have been tossed aside in haste. Either way, they were his now. And to a boy of 11 with no coin and too much time between chores, they were treasure. His name was Jahan, and he had never owned a game of any kind. Not a ball, not a board, just these 2 dice, which he kept wrapped in a cloth and tucked into the seam of his boot. After chapel, or between firewood deliveries, he would sneak behind the tannery wall and roll them softly just to see the numbers tumble. Not for money, not for dares, just for rhythm, for something to control in a world where so little could be. Then one afternoon another boy saw. This boy, Odin, was the reeve's cousin. Just old enough to sneer, just young enough to still tattle. He saw Jahan roll the dice, grinned, and asked if he could try. Jahan, unsure but polite, handed them over. That was the mistake, because Odin rolled once, laughed, and ran off, dice in hand. Jahan followed, shouting, not loudly, just enough to be heard by the wrong person at the wrong time. That person was a minor cleric walking past the grain store. He turned, saw the two boys arguing, saw the dice fall from Odon's hand onto the packed dirt of the alley, saw Jahan grab for them, and that was enough. "Dice," the cleric said, stepping closer, "are the tools of vice." Jahan froze. "They mock the casting of lots," he added. "They mock God's will." The accusation came quickly. Blasphemy. Not the full mortal kind reserved for heresy or defiance in church, but the casual sort, irreverent behaviour, they called it, playing with forbidden objects, mimicking games that Roman soldiers once played while casting lots for Christ's robes. Jahan didn't understand most of this. He only knew he hadn't done anything wrong. But by evening the steward had been informed. A hearing would be held, the priest would speak, the dice would be confiscated, and Jahan, child though he was, would be made example. When he told his mother that night, she said only, "You should have hidden them." Not, "You did nothing wrong," just, "You should have known, she should have known better." Because in that village, even children were expected to understand which kinds of joy were safe, and which could become sin with only a sideways glance. The hearing was held in the side chapel, not the nave. It wasn't formal enough for full trial, but serious enough to be witnessed by men who wore robes and carried rings of office. Jahan sat on a bench too high for his feet to touch the floor. The dice, his little cubes of bone, rested on a cloth near the altar, like relics stripped of their mystery. He was told not to speak unless spoken to, and so he didn't. The priest presiding was not cruel, but he was tired. Tired of small misbehaviours, tired of having to instruct through fear instead of wisdom. And he had heard enough sermons to know how easily games could become guilt. He asked Jahan if he knew what the dice symbolised. Jahan shook his head. "They are games of chance," the priest said, "and chance is not holy." Jahan opened his mouth, just barely, but closed it again, because he understood the game now, and it wasn't about dice, it was about distance, between what a child meant and what grown men feared. Odon, the Reeves' cousin, said nothing during the hearing. He sat with arms folded, a pinched expression on his face. He wasn't punished. He hadn't been the one holding the dice when the priest arrived. Jahan was told that he would not be whipped. Not this time. But he would be removed from chapel duties for 1 year. He would no longer be allowed to serve water during feast days. And for the duration of Lent, he would be required to sit in silence at the back of the nave, just beneath the rood screen, where the shadows fell longest and the candlelight flickered least. "The world must not think we permit such games," the priest said, "especially from the mouths and hands of children." His mother said little when he returned, just wiped his face with a damp cloth and whispered, "You'll be quiet now. It'll pass faster if you're quiet." And so he was, for days, for weeks. He walked like a boy in borrowed shoes, careful not to make noise, not to crack a smile. He no longer met friends behind the tannery wall. He no longer watched coins flick across tabletops at the tavern window. When others played with pebbles or sticks, he looked away, because even though no one had struck him, he'd been marked, not physically, but in whispers. Dice boy, they called him. Not cruelly, just enough to sting. And that in some ways lasted longer than lashes, because Jahan learned what so many children do, that a label once spoken in front of candles and robes takes longer to heal than a bruise. And perhaps the hardest part was this: he still loved the dice, not for gambling, not for rebellion, but for the sound they made when they hit the ground, like tiny thunder from a sky he could hold. Which brings us to this quiet sorrow. When a child is punished for joy mistaken as defiance, what part of wonder do they lose forever? Spring came late that year. The fields remained damp, the frost clung to the wells, and the alleys filled with the wet sound of feet on thawing earth. Jahan, still 11, now carried firewood instead of water. He no longer helped prepare the feast tables, no longer sang psalms beside the other boys. When the bell rang for service, he took his place beneath the rood screen, just as instructed, beneath the carved beams where cobwebs gathered, out of the candlelight's reach. He did not speak unless spoken to. He answered questions in half nods. And when he walked through the square, his eyes stayed on the ground. The dice were never returned. They were burned, the priest had told him, so their temptation would not pass to others. But Jahan never believed that. In his mind, they were hidden away, tucked into some drawer or sealed inside a jar, where other adults would hold them up and say, "This is what danger looks like, not evil, just too wild for a world afraid of randomness." He began to keep a stone in his pocket. It wasn't the same. It had no pips, no callers, no promise of surprise, but he held it sometimes when the quiet grew too long. It reminded him there was still something to grasp. One afternoon, weeks after Easter, he overheard two men playing real dice near the tavern wall. They laughed loudly, their words sharp with drink, silver coins clinking with each cast. No priest stopped them, no steward reprimanded them. Jehan watched from across the square and wondered, not bitterly, just curiously, how it was that grown men could play what boys were punished for. And he understood something that most children learn too early, that rules bend around power, and that fear, when wielded by authority, strikes downward more easily than upward. Years passed. Jehan grew. He became a mason's apprentice, learned to read measurements, mix lime, shape stone. He earned coin, not much, but enough. He slept under a roof, shared a bench with others, and carried his weight in full. He never spoke of the dice, not once, but he never forgot the rhythm of them, the way they sounded when dropped on wood. That small sound of freedom, of chance, of futures you couldn't plan for. He carried it in his memory, like others carry hymns. One day, as a young man, he passed a group of children playing a game with pebbles, tossing them into a ring scratched into the dirt, laughing when they missed, cheering when they landed just right. He paused, watched, then smiled, and walked on. Because he knew what they didn't yet, that play is not rebellion, that joy is not crime, and that the greatest power of all is to keep wonder alive, even when the world has tried to silence it. Her name was Alice, and she was barely 14 when the promise was made. Not by her, but for her. The man was twice her age, a tanner from the next village, with coin enough for the dowry and hands rougher than his speech. Her father, the blacksmith, had accepted the offer without asking. "It's a good match," he said. "He has land. You'll be fed." As if hunger were the only measure of love. Alice did not argue. She swept the forge yard. She salted the meat. She stitched the gown her stepmother left at the foot of her cot. She smiled when spoken to, nodded when instructed. But inside her ribs tightened with each passing day. The man, Durand, visited twice before the wedding date. He smelled of lye and bark and old blood. He pinched her cheek with fingers that didn't understand softness. He called her little dove, with a voice that made her wings feel clipped. She told no one, because in her village marriage was not about choosing, it was about being chosen, and girls who said no were called ungrateful at best, disobedient at worst. The night before the wedding, she sat beside the fire, shelling peas with hands that shook. Her father drank quietly, her stepmother dozed in a chair. No one spoke of the vows, the priest, the feast to come. These things were assumed, not celebrated. At dawn she left. No cloak, no coin, only a crust of bread and her oldest shoes. She walked west, toward the river, where reeds bent low and the fog covered her steps. Her plan was thin. There was no aunt waiting, no convent door open. Just the knowledge that staying meant disappearing into someone else's life, and leaving was the only way to keep her own. She made it as far as the woods near Saint-Cyr. There beneath a tree she slept, and there she was found. By the Reeves men, sent after her once the house had stirred, and found her cot still full of cold. They tied her wrists with cord and marched her back in silence. Her father said nothing when she returned. He only turned his face away. The priest did not scold her, the villagers didn't point, but the blacksmith's apprentice whispered, "You made a fool of him." And in a village where embarrassment was sin, this was unforgivable. That evening the aldermen met, and it was decided she would be forbogged, not as a criminal but as a daughter. Correction, they called it, restoration, to restore her to obedience, to correct her mistake of believing her life was hers to shape. She was led to the chapel square, tied at the wrist to the old linden post. The strap was leather, 3 lashes, not 5, but hard enough to draw blood, hard enough to draw silence from the crowd, and when it was done she did not cry. She simply looked out at them, eyes glassy, and whispered, not a curse, not a prayer, just one word, "Why?" No one answered, which brings us to the deepest kind of cruelty. When a girl asks for her own future and is given pain instead, what does she learn about the value of her will? The linden post stood in the square like it always had, silent, splintered and old. It had once been used to tie stubborn goats during market days, but in recent years it had found new purpose, a place of village discipline. Children were lashed there for stealing apples, apprentices for breaking tools, and now Alice for running away from the life others had planned for her. After the flogging, they unbound her wrists and handed her back to her father, like a dull tool returned to its bench. She could barely walk. The stripes across her back were red, raw, and already swelling beneath the laces of her dress. No poultice was offered, no apology whispered. Her stepmother set a bowl of barley near her cot and left without speaking. The wedding was postponed, not cancelled or just delayed. The village said she had learned her lesson. A girl of her standing didn't get to choose whom she married. She didn't have land, she didn't bring status. What she brought was obedience, or so they expected. Durand returned 2 weeks later. He said nothing about her absence, nothing about the flogging. He nodded once at the blacksmith, ate bread with onion, and examined her like someone might check a piece of timber, weathered but not broken. She did not meet his eyes. They set the new date, but something in Alice had shifted. She still did her work, still fed the hens, still swept the yard. But she no longer looked away when men passed her. She no longer nodded automatically when given an order. The pain had passed, but the mark inside her had deepened. One evening the blacksmith returned from the forge to find her mending the hearth rug. She looked up and asked, "Is there a rule for when a man says yes but a woman hasn't answered?" He paused, then said, "That's not how it works." She didn't ask again. But later that night, she sat outside alone beneath the eaves and watched the stars blink between clouds. Her back still ached. Her hands were cracked. And yet she felt, in that moment, more certain than she ever had. She would not stay. Not again. Not for a wedding, not for her father. Not for silence dressed up as duty. And this time, if she left, she would not walk alone and afraid. She would run with resolve. Which brings us to a quiet, burning thought. If a girl learns the cost of disobedience but still chooses herself, what does that say about the strength of her soul? She waited for the right moment. Not with haste this time, but with purpose. Alice had no illusions about forgiveness. The village had not softened, and neither had the man who claimed her hand, but what had changed was her understanding of silence. That it did not mean agreement. That submission spoken through clenched teeth was not consent. That when a girl runs once and is punished, she runs differently the second time, not with panic, but with knowledge. She left just before the feast day, when preparations kept everyone distracted. With the priest tending candles, her father inspecting hinges, and Durand out of sight, she took the back lane, the one behind the baker's fence, where nettles grew thick and that the path was soft with moss. She carried nothing. Only a small pouch of dried beans in her pocket and a sewing needle tied with twine around her wrist. The bruise from the lash had faded, but she still remembered where it lay. She walked south, past the turn to Saint-Cyr, past the crossroads where travellers bartered, past the village border where people stopped caring who you once were. Her feet blistered, but she did not stop. At dusk she reached a wayside shrine. The Virgin carved in wood looked as weary as Alice felt. She sat at the base of the stone, peeled off her shoes and whispered, not a prayer, but a vow, "You won't make me again." She didn't return the next day, or the day after. The wedding was called off, not because of grief, but because there was no point tying vows to an empty space. Durand left insulted but not heartbroken. Her father said little, her stepmother less. The village said she'd be back. They all did, eventually. But Alice didn't. She found work in a town where no one knew her name, cleaning linens and stitching seams in a widow's house. The woman asked no questions. Alice gave no stories. And in the quiet of the evenings, she began to feel her ribs loosen again. She never married, not because she feared men, but because she chose not to answer any more questions she hadn't asked first. Years later, when another girl from another village came through the door of that same widow's house, red-eyed and barefoot, Alice handed her bread and said only, "You're safe now." And when the girl whispered, "I ran," Alice nodded and replied, "Good." Because sometimes the strongest kind of legacy isn't surviving your own pain, it's helping someone else avoid theirs. In the market square of Vézelay, there was always bread, coarse loaves, honey-glazed rounds, and yesterday's crusts stacked in burlap sacks. The bakers rose long before dawn, their ovens filling the narrow alleys with the scent of warmth. But for some, the smell was the only nourishment they would receive. Children like Remy and Isambar, brothers by blood or hardship, it was hard to say. They had no fixed dwelling, only a corner near the tannery where the wall met a crumbling pile of bricks. They were not orphans, exactly. Their mother lived, somewhere in the countryside, last seen carrying firewood on a cart that never returned. But that was over a year ago, so they learned to beg. Not boldly, not loudly, just a hand extended at the end of the breadstall line, just a glance upward, without words. Sometimes, if they were lucky, they were tossed a hard heel. Often they were ignored. One day, Remy, older by maybe 2 years, no taller by much, approached the rear of a bakery and caught the eye of a new apprentice. The boy inside was nervous but kind. He passed Remy a scrap of rye, barely a mouthful, but more than nothing. Remy smiled, whispered thanks, but the master baker saw, not the giving, but the taking. He shouted as men do when pride feels pinched, called it theft, called it loitering, said the boys were lingering near shops with intent. The constable was summoned. There was no explanation heard, no chance to defend a scrap of bread that would have been swept to the dogs by evening. The brothers were taken to the holding cell below the Hall of Records, a damp, windowless space used mostly for drunks and thieves. They were told they'd stay overnight. "To teach you to ask the right way," the constable muttered, as if silence had been the crime. The cell smelled of mildew and copper. The straw was old. The bucket in the corner had not been emptied in days. The boys sat close. They had been hungry when they were taken. They were hungrier now. No food was offered. No questions were asked. Just a door that shut with more finality than a boy should ever know. In the morning, they were led out with sore joints and empty stomachs. The clerk scrawled their names, misspelled indifferent, into a logbook. 2 boys, loitering, intention unclear, released. They were told not to come back, but where exactly were they meant to go? Because in a town where bread was stacked high and hunger was considered suspicious, a child's open hand became a threat. And the bars they saw weren't just made of iron. They were built of blame. The constable had said it would be a lesson. One night. No beatings, no marks, just enough discomfort to ensure the boys would think twice before appearing in the market again. And in one sense, the message landed. Remy and Isambar did not return to the bread stalls the next day, or the next. They avoided the square entirely, slipping through alleys with heads down, watching for cloaks and boots rather than crumbs. But the lesson they learned was not about theft. It was about visibility. They hadn't stolen anything, not by law, but their presence, hungry, ragged, quiet, had unsettled those who measured virtue in fullness and order. They had broken no rule, only a pattern, and the cell had taught them how quickly a pattern could snap closed around someone too small to fight back. Isambard, the younger, spoke less after that. Not that he had ever spoken much, but now, even at night, beneath their patch of tarp and broken tile, he said nothing. Remy tried to coax him with nonsense songs they used to share, half-remembered rhymes their mother once sang, but the boy just stared ahead, blinking slowly, waiting for a world that would not look at him like a stain. On the 3rd day, a woman passed them in the alley and dropped a small heel of bread without a word. They didn't eat it immediately. They waited, watched. Only when the alley stayed quiet did Remy tear it in two. That was how they lived now, cautious, measured. Not children, but witnesses, of rules they had not written. They began to follow the pigs at dawn, hoping to catch scraps tossed to the gutter. Sometimes they succeeded. Sometimes they were chased away, but they never begged again. Not because they were fed, because fear is more filling than pride when you are small. The baker's apprentice, the boy who had given the scrap, was beaten later that week, not for the bread exactly, but for forgetting his place. He didn't make the same mistake again. One night a friar passed through the alley, saw the boys sleeping against stone. He left a satchel with 2 apples and a crust inside. The boys didn't open it until dawn. They didn't say thank you. Not because they weren't grateful, because they had learned the friar might be kind today, but someone else might call it charity tomorrow. And in their world, kindness was dangerous when performed in view. Which brings us to a truth we rarely name aloud. When a child is punished for asking, not taking, they say, they don't stop needing. They just stop being seen. Spring turned slowly into summer. The frost finally lifted, and the market swelled with pilgrims, tradesmen, and dusty travellers. Coins changed hands, bells rang, the bread stalls overflowed again. But Remy and Isambard no longer moved near them. Hunger still gripped them like a second skin, but the memory of the cell ran deeper than their stomachs. The one night beneath iron had left a wound no food could close. They slept now beneath the old stable awning, behind the cobbler's house where no one looked. A patch of discarded wool, damp with mildew, became their blanket. Some nights, when it rained, Isambard curled into Remy's side and trembled, not from cold but from something quieter. Dread without words. No one came for them, no one remembered them, and slowly the boys learned to expect nothing. Until one evening a merchant passed through Vézelay on his way north. His cart had broken an axle near the edge of town and he was forced to stay the night. Remy helped him load a new wheel, hands quick and skillant. The merchant asked where his family was. Remy shrugged. The man watched him for a long time, then pressed a coin into his palm. "Don't buy bread with it here," he said. "They'll ask too many questions. Just keep walking." That was the turning point. Not redemption, not rescue, just direction. The next morning Remy and Isambard left. They didn't say goodbye. They didn't know to whom they should. They followed the old road westward, beyond the vineyards and the market wagons. They stopped only for water, ate only when unseen, slept curled behind hedges, their ears tuned for footsteps. No one ever jailed them again, but no one ever welcomed them either. They became ghosts of every village, familiar only to each other. And yet, in all their wandering, they never asked again. Not with words, not with outstretched hands. Because in that cell, they had learned a rule stronger than law, that to ask while hungry is to be punished for needing. Years later, no one in Vézelay remembered their names, but the baker's boy did, and sometimes when he passed the alley where they had once waited, he left a heel of bread behind just in case. Not for ghosts, not for guilt, but for the children who would come next, asking nothing, but still hungry. He was called Pierrot, though it's unclear whether that was his true name or simply the one shouted at him most often. He was perhaps 9, possibly 10. Age was a guess in the hills above the Loire. His limbs were lean from running, his hands rough from rope, and his feet as bare as the lambs he was meant to guard. He had watched flocks since he could walk. Not his own, of course. The sheep belonged to the reeve, a man with heavy boots and heavier words. But Pierrot was fast and silent and cheap, and that made him valuable enough. The day it happened, the sky was soft with cloud. The sheep grazed as they always did on the southern slope, the lambs tugging at clumps of grass near the edge of a shallow gully. Pierrot sat beneath a hawthorn tree, chewing a bit of bark and tracing lines in the dirt with a twig. He never wandered, he never slept. But the lamb, small, pale, fast, slipped between two brambles and vanished down the slope before he could blink. He ran after it. He called, but by the time he reached the hollow, the lamb was gone. He searched until dusk, through thickets, under roots, across the stream bed. But the hills do not return what they've taken until they are ready. And when he returned with one less lamb than he'd left with, the reeve did not ask for details. He did not ask if the boy was hurt or frightened or sorry. He only asked how many. And when Pierrot answered, 1, the man nodded, as if confirming a number on a ledger. At dawn, the punishment was carried out, not in secret, not in the barn, but on the beam just outside the storehouse, where misbehaving servants were sometimes tied to cure their recklessness with sore muscles and fear. Pierrot was hoisted upside down by his ankles, a rope looped across the beam. No shoes, no shirt, no explanation. It wasn't meant to harm, just to shame. A shepherd's boy who couldn't keep a lamb, he'd feel what it meant to dangle like one. He hung there for an hour. The blood rushed to his head. The rope bit into his legs. Children passed. Women looked away. One man muttered, "Should have watched better." When they cut him down, he vomited, then was told to scrub the wall where his feet had stained it with dirt. The lamb was found the next day, caught in briars not far from the path, alive, unharmed. But by then, the punishment had been served, and Pierrot had learned the lesson most children on the edge of power do, that being blamed quickly matters more than being right eventually, which brings us to this unsettling question. If the lost are returned, but the punished are not pardoned, what exactly did the pain teach? After the lamb was found, no one said a word to Pierrot, not to apologise, not to admit the mistake. The animal had survived without him, which only deepened the unspoken implication that he hadn't been necessary at all. A child replaced by a sheep. He was sent back to the hill the very next day, the same slope, the same flock, the same hawthorn tree, as though nothing had happened, as though his head had never pounded from being upside down, as though his breath hadn't grown ragged from the weight of his own body. The rope was coiled and hung on the hook again, ready for the next example. Pierrot said nothing, but something in his walk had changed. He no longer kicked stones or ran downhill when the flock strayed. He moved slower, not out of laziness, but calculation. He began to count the sheep aloud every 10 minutes, even when no one could hear. He whispered their names, not real names, just sounds so he wouldn't forget them. 1, 2, 3, the small one with the black tail, the one with the torn ear, the one that always wandered left. The reeve never praised him. He didn't expect to be praised, but the boy noticed the way the man started watching him less, trusted him again, but not because of grace, because fear had made him useful. In the village, children still glanced at him strangely, not out of cruelty exactly, just uncertainty. What do you say to the boy who had hung like a sack of flour in the square? The boy who made no sound as he was pulled down, who walked away barefoot without turning his head. Pierrot stopped talking as much, stopped humming, stopped asking for the heel of bread at the end of the day, not because he was afraid, because asking invited memory, and memory now came with gravity. One afternoon he saw the rope being taken down again, not for him, this time for an older boy who had snapped a fence post in frustration. Pierrot watched without expression. He turned back to the flock, because he knew how long the blood took to leave your head. He knew the numbness in your hands after the rope came off. He knew that the punishment was not the hour you hung to his but the days that followed, when no one asked if you were all right. And still you had to work. Still you had to smile, if asked. Still you had to prove you deserved to stand upright again. That evening, as the sun slipped below the ridge, a lamb began to drift toward the woods. Pierrot called to it once. It didn't return. He stood, stared a moment, then stepped slowly after it, whistling low, not with anger, but with the tired care of someone who had already paid the price once. And when he guided it back, calm, firm, without a word, he counted it again, out loud, then sat beneath the hawthorn tree, pressing his palms to the dirt as if to anchor himself. Because now he understood. Shepherding sheep was simpler than shepherding trust, and the only thing heavier than a missing lamb was the memory of a rope you never asked for. Pierrot never asked to stop shepherding. In fact, he continued longer than most boys his age. Others were apprenticed to coopers or taken in by tanners. He remained on the hillside, rain or sun, counting sheep in even tones and speaking only when necessary. Not because he had nothing else to do, but because it was the one place where failure no longer reached for his ankles. The rope, of course, was still there, hung now beside the grain scales instead of the beam. They used it again, on others, on boys who broke rules, spilled seed, dropped tools. Each time Pierrot heard the barked orders, the sound of feet scraping against earth, the muttering of villagers who always said the same thing, better he learns now, and each time Pierrot stood a little stiller, a little more quiet, because he knew what they didn't. He knew the weight of humiliation carried in a child's chest long after the body had healed. One winter he found a new lamb born too early. Its legs trembled in the snow, and its mother had already turned away. Pierrot knelt, wrapped it in his tunic, and held it through the coldest night of the season. He didn't name it. He didn't speak to it. He simply kept it warm. By morning it stirred. Its ears twitched. It lived. The reeve heard about it. Of course he did. And he nodded once without praise. But that wasn't what mattered. What mattered was that when Pierrot returned to the flock the next day, the boy who had once stood next to him in silence handed him a crust of bread without being asked. "Didn't know you'd stay," the boy said. Pierrot replied, "I didn't know either." Time passed. Pierrot grew. He never forgot the rope, but he never feared it again. And when he was old enough to leave, he did. Not with anger, not with revenge, just a slow, certain step toward a future that no longer swung above his head. In the next village, they needed shepherds. He didn't mention what had happened. He didn't speak of lost lambs or upside-down mornings, but he watched every hill with careful eyes, counted every sheep, and taught the younger boys that sometimes mistakes were just signs you needed help, not punishment. Years later, when a lamb went missing under someone else's watch and the villagers looked to the rope, Pierrot said gently, "Let's find it first." And they did, because some lessons should not be taught with fear, and the ones who have lived through it are the first to know how to break that chain. Her name was Agnes, and she had always been sensitive. Not in a way that meant weakness, just tuned to everything. The change in weather, the way flour smelled when it turned, the footsteps of her mother rising from bed before dawn. Her voice could be bright with joy one minute and break with sorrow the next. It was just her nature. People used to say she had thin skin, as if feelings were something to hide. But at 6, no one expected composure. That changed one night during the Lent procession, when the parish walked in candlelit silence behind the chapel's relics. Agnes had been told to hold the edge of her mother's shawl and walk without noise, but the crowd pressed in, the smoke from the censers stung her eyes, and somewhere between the 4th psalm and the final turning she began to cry. Not softly, not politely. She sobbed loud and sudden, startled, desperate, inconsolable. At first her mother hushed her, tried to calm her with a firm hand, but the crying didn't stop. It grew, rising in the stone-walled echo of the nave. The priest stopped chanting. The procession slowed, heads turned, and when Agnes stumbled backward in panic and shrieked once, high and sharp as breaking glass, everything else halted. It wasn't just embarrassment, it was suspicion. Some whispered that she'd been touched by a spirit. Others said they saw her eyes roll back. A few insisted her voice sounded too deep for a child. She was scooped into her mother's arms and carried home, sobbing still. But by morning the questions had gathered like crows. Was she sleeping poorly? Had she been near sick cattle? Was there sin in the household? The priest requested to see her. He did not accuse. He asked questions. Did she feel strange? Did she remember the noise? Agnes shook her head. She didn't understand why she had cried. She just had. And for that they called her unclean. Not evil, not cursed, just suspicious. Enough so that she was barred from chapel for a week. Enough so that the other children were told not to stand too close. Enough so that her mother was asked to keep her indoors until she settled. But how does a child settle when the world has turned on the sound of her sorrow? She stopped crying, not because she no longer felt, but because she now knew that her voice, her pain, was something others feared. Which leads us to a quiet, aching question. When a little girl's weeping becomes a threat, what does she learn to do with all that feeling? The shutters stayed drawn for 7 days. Agnes sat inside on a stool by the hearth, fingers wrapped around the hem of her tunic, eyes wide and dry. Her mother swept, chopped, mended. Her father stayed mostly away, either embarrassed or uncertain what to do with a daughter spoken of in whispers. The neighbours passed slower near their door now. At the well, her mother wasn't asked about her bread. The air hung heavy, not with guilt, but with the peculiar stillness that only suspicion can bring. Agnes didn't cry again. Not once. She barely spoke. The girl who used to ask dozens of questions a day, why the birds flew in circles, why the leaves fell early, why the priest's robes changed colours, had gone quiet, lips parted only to eat or murmur prayers when prompted. Her seance was called obedient. But it wasn't obedience. It was armour. Because what no one told her was that once you're feared for your voice, every sound feels dangerous, even your own name. When she was finally brought back to Mass the following Sunday, she wore a scarf over her head and sat pressed between her mother and the wall. She was still unmoving. She did not look at the priest. She did not sing. Afterward, a woman leaned toward her mother and whispered, "She seems improved." Agnes heard it. She heard everything now, every breath, every judgment behind a nod. The children at catechism gave her space, not cruelly, just carefully. They spoke to her like someone who'd come close to something strange, like a girl who knew something they didn't and maybe shouldn't. She was 6, but they treated her like a warning. At home, she began lining up pebbles along the edge of the hearth. One for every day she didn't cry. She counted them, stared at them. When her mother asked what they were for, Agnes answered, "It keeps me good." The woman didn't question it. She was just relieved to hear her daughter speak again. That winter, Agnes had a fever. It wasn't serious, but she moaned in her sleep. Her mother held her gently and whispered prayers, eyes glancing toward the door as if afraid someone might hear. The memory of that night in the chapel had left a stain no water could wash. And yet, what Agnes remembered most wasn't the crying. It was the sound that followed. People stepping away, Because what she had learned wasn't that feelings were wrong, only that feelings had consequences, and those consequences lived in silence. Which leaves us here, in this hard and quiet place. If a child is punished for expressing pain, what does she do with it when it returns? As the years passed, Agnes grew taller, steadier, and quieter still. She became the kind of child neighbours admired from a distance, well-mannered, tidy, respectful. She never raised her voice, never interrupted, never disagreed. If asked how she felt, she would smile faintly and say, "I'm fine," even when she wasn't. Inside, she still carried the memory of that night, the candle smoke, the weight of too many eyes, the way her own voice had escaped her like a bird in a storm. But she had long since buried it, not forgotten, just folded neatly and tucked beneath the daily rhythm of things. At the market, she walked behind her mother, basket in hand, nodding when spoken to. At home, she worked with calm diligence, scrubbing linens and pinching pie crusts with perfect precision. And in church, she sang, but only with the group, never alone. The sound of her own voice outside the chorus still made her nervous. Not because she feared it, because she didn't fully trust it anymore. People said, "She's grown up so well." They meant, "She doesn't cause trouble." But what they didn't see was how tightly she held herself when she felt overwhelmed. How her hands trembled when someone shouted, even if it wasn't at her. How she stopped herself from crying even when no one else was around, just in case. She had learned to survive in a world where tears were mistaken for danger, and she had survived well, but surviving is not the same as healing. One day, a younger girl from the village, barely 4, burst into tears during chapel after dropping her wooden rosary. The noise echoed across the stone floor, bouncing upward into the arched ceiling. Agnes, now 15, turned sharply. For just a moment, she was back in that moment herself. Candles burning, psalms cut short, shame pressing like wool across her throat. The little girl's mother bent to hush her, but Agnes stepped forward. "It's all right," she said softly. "She's just frightened." The mother looked startled, grateful too. Agnes knelt, picked up the beads, and handed them back to the girl. "She's not wicked," Agnes added. The priest seated at the front raised his eyes, but said nothing, and the chapel remained still. That night, at home, Agnes sat alone and, for the first time in years, allowed herself to cry. Not because she was afraid, but because she wasn't anymore. The silence had protected her once, but now, finally, she was learning something even more powerful. That a child's tears do not summon spirits. Only truth. They weren't trying to disturb anyone. That was the part no one listened to later. The 2 boys, Etienne and Lucas, sons of the village miller, were only singing as they walked home from the riverbank, their arms slung over each other's shoulders, their bare feet smacking against the cold stones. The day had been long, full of water hauling and sack-lifting, and the melody, a simple tavern rhyme picked up from the ferryman, rose from them not with mischief but with relief. It was after sundown. The curfew bell had rung an hour earlier, calling all good men and obedient children to their thresholds. But the boys had lingered, as boys do, distracted by frogs in puddles and the way echoes bounce against the stone walls of the mill house. By the time they reached the square, the shadows were long and the streets mostly empty, except for the watchman, rounding his second circuit with a lantern in one hand and a stick in the other. He heard them before he saw them. Their voices carried, tuneful, unrefined, the sound of joy unmeasured. That, more than the hour, was what offended him. Laughter after dark was considered careless. Music, even from children, was noise if not sanctified. And so, when they turned the corner and nearly ran into the circle of his lantern light, they froze. Etienne dropped his voice to a whisper. Lucas hiccuped a half-laugh. "You think this is a game?" the man growled. "No, sir," Etienne said quickly. "We were only walking," Lucas added. "The mill ran long today." "And singing like drunks," the watchman spat. "Past curfew, public disorder." He didn't take them home. That would have been too lenient. He took them to the square and summoned the steward. Within the hour, the boys were bent over the low post beside the chapel wall, palms flat against stone, their sleeves rolled up. The cane was light but swift. 3 strokes each, 1 for the hour, 1 for the noise, and 1 to set example. They didn't cry, but they didn't sing again either. At home, their father said nothing. He poured soup into wooden bowls and broke the bread in silence. Their mother placed salve on the backs of their hands without scolding, her mouth a tight line as she worked. "You should have known better," was all she said. But how could they have known? They'd broken no gate, spilled no grain, taken nothing, just sung a song, and now, every time they walked home from the river, they did so in silence. Etienne hummed once under his breath a few weeks later. Lucas shook his head. Better not, because the streets had ears, and childhood joy uninvited was sometimes heard as defiance. Which brings us to this quiet thought. When a tune becomes a transgression, what sort of silence does it leave behind? The bruises on their hands faded, as bruises do, but the quiet stayed. Etienne and Lucas no longer sang on the way to the river, nor on the long path back through the fields. They no longer whistled while loading sacks of grain or chased each other with flower-dusted palms. Their laughter thinned out, not all at once, but like steam leaving a kettle with the fire turned low. Their father, the miller, didn't speak of the punishment again. He had his own troubles, gears that needed greasing, a wheel that wouldn't catch, and creditors who arrived more often than they should. But he noticed the change in his sons, how they moved more slowly, even when not tired, how they jumped at shouts that weren't for them, how they no longer asked silly questions about why the moon looked different in winter, or how flour turned to bread. One evening, a man from the next village passed through and offered the boys a coin if they could sing the old river song. He smiled as he said it, clearly meant no harm. But Etienne only looked away, and Lucas, after a long pause, answered softly, "We don't sing anymore." The man looked puzzled, but didn't ask, because he saw something in their eyes that didn't invite further talk. At the chapel, Father Bertram noticed too. The boys had once joined in hymns with strength, even when off-key. Now their voices were low, hesitant, swallowed by the chants around them. After Mass, he asked gently, "Why so quiet, lads?" Lucas shrugged. Etienne said nothing, and the priest, who had not intervened when they were caned, said no more. Because what could he say? He hadn't stopped it, and silence once planted grows deeper roots than most care to admit. At night, their mother tried once to hum the lullaby she'd sung when they were smaller. It was a little thing, old and wordless, but even then the boys stayed still, their eyes fixed on the ceiling beams as if measuring something they could not name. She never hummed again after that. Weeks passed, then months. The fields turned, the rains returned, the world moved on, but not everything did. Because inside those boys, Etienne and Lucas, as something had been tied off, not by the cane, but by the lesson, that happiness made at the wrong hour could be mistaken for guilt, and they'd rather stay quiet than be struck for joy, which brings us gently to this reflection. When fear teaches a child that expression is dangerous, what beauty does the world lose without ever knowing it? It was nearly a year before either boy sang again. Not publicly, not in the square, not even within the earshot of their father, who still ground wheat and barley in silence, the steady churn of the mill wheel now the loudest thing in their home. But one afternoon, as the sun slipped beneath the thatch and the wind pushed golden dust into the cracks of the floorboards, Etienne sat by the river and let out a single hum. It wasn't planned, it just happened. A low sound, drawn out and wavering like the current. Lucas, standing waist-deep in the stream with the washing, turned his head, said nothing, but later that night, while laying out the grain sacks, he whistled a single note back. They didn't speak about it, but they both heard it, and slowly, like moss creeping back over a stone, their voices began to return. Not in town, not near the square, but in quiet places, between hedges, inside the mill when only they were there. The songs were shorter now, lower, without words, as if the melodies themselves had learned not to rise too high. Etienne fashioned a flute from reed. Lucas tapped rhythms on the grain trough. The music stayed small, like a secret, but it lived. One afternoon they were caught, not by the watchman, not by the steward, by a travelling mason resting by the road. He heard their faint notes drifting from a grove and asked who was playing. When they stepped out, pale and sheepish, the man only smiled. "You boys sound like the wind's been waiting for you," he said, and kept walking. It was the first time anyone had spoken of their music without suspicion. It made something shift, just a little, enough that weeks later Etienne hummed while walking through the far field, and when no punishment came, he did it again. Lucas began carving notches into bark, pretending they were staves. They never went back to full voice, never led chants or sang across rooftops, but they stopped fearing the sound of themselves. By the time they were old enough to leave the mill, they had learned a quiet kind of resilience, not the kind forged in fists or fire, but in the refusal to let beauty die completely. And though no one in the village ever apologised for those 3 canings at the chapel wall, the brothers carried something better than an apology. They carried a voice that had survived being taken, and in the end, when asked if they regretted that song on the night of the curfew, Etienne once replied, "Only that no one sang with us." His name was Julien, though everyone in the kitchen simply called him Boy. He was 12, maybe 13. It was hard to tell beneath the soot and flour that constantly dusted his sleeves. He had been apprenticed to the abbey cook, not by choice, but by need. His father had died in a quarry fall, and his mother, left with 2 younger mouths to feed, had sent him to the monastery kitchens with a small satchel and the promise that they feed the ones who work. And work he did. From sun-up to deep dusk, he stirred porridge, peeled root vegetables, fetched water from the pump, and scrubbed the stone floor until it reflected light. He never spoke out of turn, he never took food without permission. He slept near the cinders and kept his head low, but that day it was the ladle, or rather the long-handled spoon used to stir the bean stew in the large copper pot. He had used it hundreds of times, but this time, when lifting it quickly to prevent the bottom from scalding, it cracked at the base of the handle and split with a dry snap. The stew sloshed but did not spill, the pot remained upright. But the kitchen fell silent. Brother Edouard turned sharply, face flushed. "That spoon was ash," he snapped. "Seasoned for years. That's a loss." Julien apologised. Instantly, fully. He knelt. He offered to eat nothing that day. He promised to whittle another. But the monk didn't want penance. He wanted example. "This," Brother Edouard announced, "is what carelessness looks like." And within the hour Julien found himself marched to the edge of the courtyard, where the old stocks stood, more often used as warning than actual sentence. He was placed in them as the midday bells rang, knees bent, arms through the holes, neck resting in the groove worn smooth by age. A placard was hung on his chest. Wasteful. No trial. No hearing. Just correction. He stayed there through the afternoon, the sun heating the wood until it bit into his skin. Novices passed, pretending not to see. One boy laughed. A visiting friar frowned but said nothing. Julien didn't weep, but his face burned, not from the heat, but from the weight of being seen. By vespers his legs were cramping. By Compline he was shaking, but still no release. Only at dawn did someone quietly lift the latch. It wasn't the monk, it was the abbot's housekeeper, silent and expressionless. She handed him a crust and walked away. He ate it kneeling, fingers numb. The spoon, as it turned out, was already glued. But the mark left on Julien wasn't. Because what he had broken wasn't just ashwood. It was the illusion that being careful would always keep you safe. And what kind of lesson is that? When Julien returned to the kitchen, the other apprentices glanced his way, but none spoke. The fire had already been lit, the pots already boiling. Brother Edouard, wiping his hands on his apron, nodded once, briefly, formally, and pointed toward the root basket. No welcome, no scolding, just work, as though nothing had happened, but something had. Julien no longer stepped with the same rhythm. His movements, once quick and light, became measured, cautious. When he reached for a knife, he checked the edge twice. When he stirred broth, his eyes never left the pot. It was not just fear. It was the memory of stillness, of being trapped, of having his breath match the clang of the bell, of being looked at but not seen. The placard, wasteful, had been removed. But he felt its echo each time someone passed without addressing him. He scrubbed harder. He slept less. He offered to repair tools no one asked him to touch. And yet, even when doing everything right, he felt wrong, because once you are punished for a mistake made without malice, your own shadow begins to suspect you. One night the abbot himself entered the kitchen. He was not a cruel man, nor often involved in the day-to-day workings of the lower abbey, but he noticed Julien moving with stiff shoulders and whispered something to Brother Edouard that the boy couldn't hear. Later the cook muttered, "You're to serve the priest's table tomorrow. Don't drop anything." Julien nodded. Serving at the priest's table was supposed to be an honour, but he knew it was also a test. The next day he carried the platters carefully, his hands steady despite the tremble in his legs. He did not speak unless addressed. He bowed his head low. One priest asked for more broth. Julien served it perfectly. Another asked what had happened to the boy's cheek, noticing the faint redness that still lingered from resting against the stock's wood all night. Julien only replied, "Discipline for father." The priest said nothing more. Afterward, Julian washed the bowls behind the chapel in a silence that tasted like iron. Not punishment, not quite shame, just the quiet that settles in when dignity has been bent but not broken. Brother Edouard passed by once, paused and said, "See that you remember it." Julian said nothing, but he did remember, not the breaking, not even the hunger, but the stillness, the slowness of time when you're placed on display, and the quiet cruelty of knowing that even when you are released, no one rushes to welcome you back. Which leads us to this quiet reckoning. If a child learns caution from pain, what does he lose in the part of him that once moved freely? Time, as it often does, moved on, seasons changed, novices were replaced, and the rhythm of the abbey kitchens continued its endless beat of boiling, baking, scrubbing, and silence. Julian remained. He never asked to leave, and no one suggested he should. His hands grew stronger, his arms more calloused, and his eyes older than his age. He never broke another spoon. He carved one me, though. Late at night by candle end, when the day's work was finally done and the world had gone quiet. From a block of spare elm meant for kindling, he whittled carefully, slowly, using the small utility knife hidden behind the firewood rack. Not ornate, not fancy, just smooth, balanced, strong. When it was finished, he wrapped it in linen and tucked it beneath his bedding. He never used it, never showed it, but it was there, proof perhaps that he was not wasteful, that he could make as well as break, that what had been taken from him, his voice, his name, his place, could be quietly reclaimed, if only in secret. He rose earlier than the others, volunteered for the messiest tasks. He earned no praise, but he was never punished again, and that, in the eyes of the abbey, was success. One spring a new apprentice arrived, smaller than Julian had been, awkward with the ladle, clumsy with words. On his third day the boy dropped a wooden bowl, and it cracked neatly down the centre. Everyone froze. Brother Edouard turned slowly. Julian stepped forward before the monk could speak. "I'll repair it," he said. "He's not used to the weight yet." The room waited. Brother Edouard blinked, then waved them both on. No punishment was issued. The boy cried later alone, not from pain but from relief. Julian sat near him and passed over a crust of bread. Neither said much, they didn't have to, because sometimes the loudest truths are carried in actions, not explanations. Julian remained in the abbey for years. Eventually he was given a small corner near the storeroom where he managed tools and oversaw kitchen supplies. He trained new boys, watched carefully, corrected gently, and never once reached for the cane that hung, dusty and unused, on the backdoor hook. He still had the spoon he'd carved. He kept it in a drawer behind the dry herbs. And on days when his hands trembled from fatigue or the world felt too large and cold, he'd touch it. Not as a weapon, not as proof, but as memory. That he had endured, that he had created, that he had never broken anything that couldn't one day be remade. It began with a prank. The sort of harmless mischief that had passed through every village in every season. 3 boys, an unattended cart, and too much time between chores. The cart had been left near the barley store, its back wheel perched awkwardly on a slope. Jahan, Raoul and Floris, all of them under 12, decided it would be funny to give it a push. Not far, just enough to watch it roll a few feet, maybe tip slightly. They didn't think about the sacks inside, or the slope that steepened just after the bend. The cart rolled farther than expected, struck a post, tipped. Barley spilled into the mud like golden sand. The boys froze, then ran, but not fast enough. A field hand saw, called out. A steward's clerk gave chase. They were caught near the well, panting and wild-eyed, dragged by their collars through the square to the grainmaster's hall. The spilled barley was not worth much, but in a village where food was weighed against winters and every sack mattered, the mess was treated like a theft. "It was just a joke," Jean stammered. "We didn't take anything." "That's the problem," the clerk snapped. "You don't know what anything costs." A trial wasn't needed, only a verdict. They were sentenced to public beating, not by cane, but by rod, and not in private, but in the square where others could watch. To remind them, the steward said, that mischief wastes, and waste is theft. Jahan's mother wept. Raoul's father said he deserved it. Floris's older brother tried to intervene, but was held back by 2 farmhands. The boys were lashed one by one, shoulders to bare, knees on the stone, backs taut under the rod. Not long, 3 strikes each, not designed to maim, only to humiliate, and humiliate it did. Because by evening every child in the village had heard what happened, and the 3 boys, who had only wanted to see something roll, were now watched like thieves, not because they'd taken, but because they'd been punished like those who did. From that day forward, none of them played in public again, and though their hands healed, their names did not. Which brings us to this harsh lesson, whispered beneath the noise of authority. When mischief is mistaken for malice, how long before children learn that curiosity must come with a cost? In the days that followed, the boys returned to their routines, though none of them returned to themselves. Jahan no longer raced to the square barefoot with a rush of energy. Raoul, who once sang while feeding the hens, moved quietly from task to task, eyes down, lips closed. Floris stopped showing up for chores entirely unless called by name. The worst part was not the pain. It had passed quickly enough. Raised welts, yes, but nothing lasting. The real wound came in the glances, the shift in tone when adults spoke to them, the caution in the voices of those who used to laugh along with their games. Now people paused before handing them tools, watched too long when they passed by the grain store, and when other children played, Jahan and the others were never asked to join. They weren't banned, just excluded, quietly, deliberately. They had been made examples, not just of what not to do, but of what happens when a child's mistake becomes a man's crime. Jahan tried once to explain, to a visiting tanner's son who asked, "Did you really steal the barley?" "No," Jahan said. "It tipped. We didn't take anything." The boy tilted his head. "But they beat you?" Jahan nodded. "And I guess it's the same." And that was it. Guilt by punishment. Punishment as proof. At home, Jahan's mother stitched herbs into a pouch and hung it above his bed. To ward off misfortune, she said. But what she couldn't ward off was the growing distance between her son and the world. She tried to make him laugh, told him stories, baked his favourite cakes when she had flour to spare. But even when he smiled, it didn't reach his eyes. Floris, who had always dreamed of apprenticing to the carpenter, was quietly passed over when the time came. Not dependable, someone said. Raoul was kept home more. His father decided it was best he focus on chores. The cart incident was never spoken of again by the stewards. It was for them concluded. Justice done. Lesson delivered. But for the boys, it had only begun. Because once a child is called something enough times, they begin to believe it might be true. Not because they remember what they did, but because they remember how it made them feel. Which leaves us with a sobering thought. When we punish carelessness like crime, do we teach children not to do wrong, or simply not to be seen? By the time another year passed, the story of the cart and the barley had become village background noise. A thing half remembered by adults and mostly forgotten by children too young to know who Jahan, Raoul and Floris had been before that day. But the boys hadn't forgotten. The bruises had faded from skin but not from speech. They no longer interrupted. They no longer asked to try things before being shown. They completed tasks without question and left quietly when dismissed. Jahan grew taller, stronger. He helped with repairs around the village. He always asked twice before moving tools. When asked a question, he gave the shortest answer possible. People called him obedient, but what they meant was that he no longer looked like trouble. Raoul worked the fields. He'd been a bright boy once, clever, always offering ideas, but now he worked exactly as told, no more, no less. His father said proudly, "He's learned to be steady." Floris stopped speaking above a whisper. His laugh, once high and sharp like a bell, had vanished. When the cartwright finally offered an apprenticeship to another boy, Floris didn't react, just nodded and said he preferred farm work anyway. The thing they never spoke of was this, how one moment of impulsive play had rewritten how they saw themselves. They had never meant harm, but they had been punished like thieves. So they learned not to draw attention, not to take up space, not to act before asking, because the lesson had been burned into them, not that mischief was wrong, but that mischief was dangerous, and once you'd been punished for joy, you stopped trusting joy entirely. Years later, Jahan, now a man with a square jaw and hands hardened by work, saw a group of children laughing as they rolled a small barrel down a slope near the orchard. He flinched. One child lost her footing and fell. Another shouted in alarm. Jahan stepped forward instinctively, but then stopped. No one was hurt. No one scolded. The children gathered the barrel, helped the girl up and rolled it again, laughter echoing off the stone walls. He watched for a long moment, then turned and walked on. He didn't smile, but his steps grew lighter, because somewhere inside he knew what he wished someone had said to him all those years ago, that mischief is not malice, that laughter isn't theft, and that children should be corrected with kindness, not fear. In the narrow alleys beneath the towering bell towers of Paris, the street children moved like ghosts, quick, alert and nameless. They weren't all orphans, though many had no mothers to call for. They weren't all thieves, though many had stolen crusts when no hand would offer them. They belonged to no one, and in a city overflowing with faith, bread and gold leaf for bishops' robes, there was still no space made for them. They slept under carts, in the corners of courtyards, between barrels behind bakeries. They learned which churches left doors unlocked after vespers, and which innkeepers would chase them off with broomsticks. And slowly the city began to speak of them not as children, but as a problem, a crowd, a nuisance, a threat. So came the decree. In the year of plague and penance, as processions grew longer and patience shorter, the Parliament ordered that all vagrant children found begging, stealing, or loitering after curfew were to be arrested and branded. An iron letter, V for voleur. Thief, no trial, no stiffment, only identification. Some were as young as 7. One boy, Mathieu they called him, was caught with a boiled onion lifted from a cart. He had eaten nothing for 2 days. He ran when shouted at, not from guilt, but fear. A guardsman grabbed him. The baker said nothing, just nodded. The sentence was automatic. They took him to the registry first, wrote his name, though no one asked how to spell it, then to the cellar, where a fire already glowed and the iron waited in the coals. The clerk marked his shoulder, not deep, just enough to scar. He screamed once, then went quiet. He was given no salve, no blanket, just the pain and the letter, burned red across his skin. The guards tossed him out after midnight, into the alley behind the tribunal. The brand would scab, then heal, then remain. He didn't go near the bakeries again. He didn't go anywhere during daylight, because now, when people saw him, they didn't see a child. They saw the mark, and that mark was all it took to remove his name. Mathieu didn't cry after the branding, not because the pain was gone, it wasn't, but because something in him had gone quiet. Not numb exactly, just emptied. He wandered the streets for days, keeping to the shadows near the Seine, where fishermen sometimes dropped scraps. He avoided shop windows and didn't beg, not directly. He'd learned how even looking hungry could make someone point and say, "That one." Others had been marked too. He started to see them. A girl with the letter burned above her elbow, hidden beneath an old wool sleeve. A boy with a fresh scab near the collarbone, walking stiffly, eyes dull. They didn't speak to each other. Not because they were unfriendly, but because they all understood. To be marked was to become alone. They passed like ghosts in daylight, and only when night fell did they sometimes gather, not to talk, but to sleep near the same drainpipe, where the stones gave off warmth from the day's sun. City folk saw them and stepped aside, not from pity, from certainty. The brand told them everything they needed to know, not who the child was or why they had done what they did, but that they had already been decided. It didn't matter if Mathieu never stole again. The iron said he had. That was enough. Once he tried to explain to a friar passing through the alley, "I was just hungry." But the friar frowned and replied, "We all are." The baker who had accused him never spoke to him again. He didn't need to. He had said all there was to say with a nod. What does that say about the way we punish the hungry but welcome the devout? He hadn't meant to wear the shell more than a day, just long enough to cross through the village unseen, to slip past the stew of whispers and pointing fingers. But something strange happened as he walked with the scallop badge pinned to his threadbare cloak. People stepped aside, doors stayed open a little longer. He was offered water at one doorstep, a heel of bread at another. A widow touched his arm and said, "Pray for my husband, when you reach the shrine." The boy nodded. He didn't speak, as the old pilgrim had advised, and this silence, so natural to him before, became sacred now. When people asked where he was bound, he pointed west. When they asked how far he'd come, he placed a hand over his heart, and when someone once pressed a coin into his palm and said, "May St. James keep your feet strong," he didn't flinch. He kept walking. That first village blurred into another, then another. Soon he wasn't hiding anymore. He was simply on the road. Each time someone noticed his smallness, his hunger, his hollow cheeks, they were softened by the shell. It gave meaning to his movement, purpose to his wandering. He was no longer a boy without a roof, he was a boy with a mission. At night, he sometimes slept beneath trees and whispered to himself just to hear a voice again. "Pilgrim," he said aloud once. It didn't feel false anymore, and the strange thing was, in living the part, he began to feel the stillness it gave him. No one struck him, no one accused, and though he still scraped crusts from the backs of inns and drank from horse troughs when needed, it was done as a traveller in passing, not a stray being chased away. One afternoon an old monk walked beside him for a mile, didn't ask much, just kept pace. At the edge of the road he looked down at the boy and said, "You're carrying something heavier than your pack." The boy didn't know what to say, and the monk continued, "Let it rest here. Keep walking with just your legs." And then, just like the first man with the shell, he left. But the boy stayed on the road, not to Compostela, not really, but toward a place where no one would ask who he'd been before. Because in this role he never meant to play, he had found something that looked like freedom. Which leads us now to this quiet truth. Sometimes a child must step into a lie not to deceive, but to survive a world that only trusts the suffering it recognizes. By the time autumn rolled across the hills, the boy had travelled farther than he ever imagined. He no longer counted the days. The path had become a rhythm. Wake with the light. Walk. Accept what was offered. Sleep where the stars allowed. He rarely thought of the comb, the false accusation, or the cell he'd narrowly escaped. Those belonged to a different boy, a shadow left behind beneath a baker's window. He still wore the shell. By now the edges had dulled. The thread that held it was frayed. But it stayed pinned above his heart, his presence a kind of shield, fragile but respected. He met others on the road, real pilgrims, most of them old, limping, whispering prayers. They shared fire and dried fish, mumbled rosaries, and never asked why a child walked alone. One man, missing a toe and smiling through his pain, gave the boy a woolen scarf and said, "St. James sends angels in small forms." The boy didn't respond, but he kept the scarf, and sometimes he believed him. In one village a woman took him in for a week. She didn't ask much, let him sweep, carry kindling, mind the goats. On the last morning she said, "You walk with purpose, you should stay." He thought about it. He almost did. But something in him couldn't stay still, not yet. The road still called, even if the shrine no longer did. Eventually the shell broke. A child too young to know its meaning pulled at it, laughing, and the brittle thing cracked in half. The boy didn't scold her. He picked up the pieces and wrapped them in cloth. The badge was gone, but the walk remained, and so did the quiet. He was no longer hiding, but he also wasn't explaining, because by then he'd learned something deeper than escape. He'd learned how to move through a world that looked at orphans with suspicion but pilgrims with reverence. He'd learned that a child who asks for help is ignored, but a child who walks toward a holy place is blessed. He never made it to Compostela, but he found what he hadn't known he was looking for, a way to walk through the world without being chased by it. Years later, a man in a riverside village, strong-backed, soft-spoken, offered shelter to a boy running from something unnamed. He handed the child a crust of bread and said, "You don't have to explain, just keep walking if you need to." And when the child asked, "Where?" he answered, "Anywhere that lets you walk like you belong there." As the voices of that distant world fade, what lingers is not punishment, but tenderness. A soft, aching thought for the small hands once chained, the silent endurance of children whose only crime was being born too soon into a hard age. In every stone cell, in every cold cot, the simplest dream remained, to be held, to be heard, to be loved. And now there are no more stories to follow tonight, only the hush of history and your own peaceful breath. Let the world fade away. May you find calm, and may your dreams be gentle and deep.